Today on the show, we're going to look at the best transfer quarterbacks in college football, some starting true freshmen, and who overachieved in recruiting and who underachieved in recruiting. Welcome to Athlon U. My name is Braden Gall. What's going on, Steven?
Braden, we have reached the long part of the college football offseason, I guess. Now that the Super Bowl is over, there's no football until the USFL or CFL or spring practice settles in. So the long, quiet football offseason is here, my friend. Did you enjoy the Super Bowl?
I actually did because I had the Eagles on the money line. I thought the Eagles were the better team. I do think there are some lessons you can take from that, which is draft a lot of really great defensive players and offensive linemen and build a system around your quarterback. And if you do that well enough, you can beat the best player in the world. I'm not surprised at all that the Eagles won. Surprised at how it happened. Love the halftime show. Also love that half of America doesn't understand it. But I loved it. I thought it was great. I thought it was cool. I enjoyed it. But other than that, kind of a boring game. I really wish it was better. I asked my 8-year-old, I was like, you having fun? She's like, no. I was like, who are you rooting for? She's like, overtime. I'm like, good job, honey. You're learning.
You are teaching her well
Yeah.
by rooting for overtime. I, too, anticipated a much closer game, but it also reminded me, and not to date ourselves, but like in the 90s, like there were a lot of Super Bowls that were like one-sided. It was kind of like, well, I'm just going to watch it for the commercials because the game is going to be one-sided. So a little bit of a bummer there, but at the same time, it was cool to see guys like Jalen Hurts and Devonta Smith and some of those Cooper DeJean, guys we've seen ball out in college the last couple of years, have a good Super Bowl. So I don't know what we're going to do. I guess we have to talk to our families now that the football season's over, right? Or I guess we're going to be into baseball. F1 season's coming up, right? There's still some things to keep us busy.
New York Mets, baby. EPL season, the Premier League is underway. We're rounding into form there. No, there's lots of stuff to do. College basketball season, of course, all kinds of stuff. If you're watching on YouTube, we do appreciate that. Thumbs up, subscribe, turn on the notifications. We would appreciate that, of course. And make sure you're writing reviews on the podcast application of choice. 5 stars only. If you do not give us 5 stars, you are a hater. Look, what do Nolan Smith, Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, Nakobe Dean, Devontae Smith, Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, what do all those guys have in common?
I believe they are former SEC stars. Is that right?
Highly rated recruits played in the SEC. Again, don't make it rocket science. Draft really good football players. Nolan Smith, I believe, was the #1 player in the country coming out of high school. And they definitely, the Eagles, like, not to go back, not to stick on the Super Bowl here, but I think the Eagles won the Super Bowl a few years ago because they had a vastly superior offensive and defensive line to the Patriots, and they beat Tom Brady. We see that with Tom Brady losing. Every time Tom Brady or a GOAT loses, Tom Brady lost to the Giants twice because the Giants' defensive lines were just far superior. When you can get pressure with 4 and you can win the line of scrimmage with 4, that's it. Ohio State, national champions. Michigan, national champions. All those Georgia teams, national champions, all because they dominated the line of scrimmage. And I know we overvalue recruiting rankings to some degree, and that's kind of where I want to start, which is how much should we value still what is the largest chunk of your roster, right? Like the largest, biggest, most important chunk of your top 60 players on your team still come to your team through traditional recruiting methods. And we'll get into who did well and who sort of maybe needs to be concerned. That's still the rule here. That's still what I learned from the Eagles, what I learned, invested in capital in their defensive and offensive lines, and that resulted in a championship. Sure, it helps that you had, the Giants decided to just give you Saquon Barkley, and the Titans here in Nashville decided to give you A.J. Brown for basically nothing. That certainly helps, but the lessons still hold true in all levels of football. Win the line of scrimmage, especially with 4 on defense, you got a good chance to win the game.
Yeah, it's funny how sometimes football is like a very complicated game, but also very simple. And it's like if you have good line of scrimmage, offensive and defensive linemen, and great quarterbacks, you can win a lot of games. And despite all complicated play design schemes and for all the X's and O's we talk about, it just comes back to having good dudes at the line of scrimmage. I did kind of chuckle a little bit when you were talking about some of these guys who were from the SEC and former high recruits. And I thought, we mentioned Jalen Hurts earlier, but it is funny now when you see, and this is totally random, it just made me think about it, but like every time there's a conference championship game, guys from previous teams are honored, and so it's like Vince Young, SEC legend now, like Chase Daniel, SEC legend. Like they didn't play it down in the
No.
SEC, but of course it's like scrambled our brains because of conference realignment.
Well, what's funny is I don't know where I think I got into this on Twitter where I was kind of just curious about receivers in the NFL. And there's so many LSU receivers that are doing incredible things. There's so many Ohio State receivers, certainly with Jeremiah Smith coming, that trend is going to continue. Egbuka is going to be a great NFL player. Ohio State's loaded. Alabama is loaded with a ton of receivers. USC is loaded with a ton of receivers out there in the NFL. And I had Jameson Williams listed as Alabama. And it's like, well, doesn't Ohio State get a little credit for that too? Even in the modern era, and you're trying to like decide which school has more clout with this position or whatever, you still kind of have to say like, oh yeah, I guess that guy did change teams in college. It just is what it is. Again, I'm not bemoaning it. It just makes for interesting conversations.
So we're going to see more of what Russell Wilson did, like on Sunday Night Football, where he would say a whole pack of Badgers when he was introducing himself on the starting lineups, so you get the Wolfpack and you get the Badgers mentioned in there, so that way you acknowledge all your teams. I don't know what some of these guys are going to do that have transferred 3 or 4 times. They're going to have to come up with some sort of sentence, but it does complicate the record books and complicate the awards, and it also makes for college football, has made it a little bit more complicated in recruiting rankings, and I still think that there is still a lot of truth in recruiting rankings, but I do think the attrition in the portal probably lessens the importance a little bit of some of these data points.
I want a Jaden Rashada Malik Murphy Super Bowl where it's like one side is Florida Gators, Arizona State Sun Devils, Georgia Bulldogs, ? And then the other one's the Texas Longhorns, Duke Blue Devils, Oregon State Beavers. What?
Well-traveled quarterbacks. That's a theme of every season now.
To be fair, though, we don't need anybody acting like Russell Wilson on national TV. Like a whole pack of Badgers. Come on with that. That's ridiculous. I say this as a person who loved Russell Wilson in college. Like, come on with that. Okay. You remember Athlon days. Like, I drafted him as a freshman on my fantasy team in like 2009 or whatever. And I was like, this guy's awesome.
I remember that.
Like I was a huge Russell Wilson fan. Going back to the NC State days of Russell Wilson. All right, let's take a look at some of these recruiting rankings here, and this is going to be framed in what we do every year, which is sort of looking at overall the top 70 or 80 rosters and how they've recruited over the last 5 years. And that's sort of the framework for how we discuss some of the teams that did well this year. So, for example, the top one that stood out to me, I don't know, I want to know what you think about this, but the number one team that stood out to me is SMU. This is the team that had 106th rated class, 72nd rated class, 82nd rated class, 51st class. Their average class ranking heading into this season is 68.2, not very good, but number 30 in the recruiting rankings. And this is all 24/7 Sports, correct?
Yes.
24/7 Sports, their 30th rated class. All the classes are a little different, but by and large, the composite is the best. You know, it kind of brings them all together. But number 30, that's clearly taking advantage of the scheme that they run, the location that they're in, the conference that they're in now, and of course the success they just had on the field. Normally it's not that quickly. You don't see the results that quickly. Normally it's the following cycle. We saw it a lot with SMU. I thought SMU one of the best jobs on the trail so far.
So there's a little bit of nuance in SMU's recruiting. I went back and looked at this. I was curious about why their classes have ranked a little on the low side. And I think some of it is they have brought in a lot of transfers. They've had smaller classes. And if you look at the point value for their average class of like 15 players, it's a little bit better than, 72nd in the nation. But still, your point being 106 and then to all the way to 30th this year is a significant jump. And I think this sort of speaks to the job. First of all, Brett Lashley's done a nice job at SMU, but one of the better recruiting classes in the ACC this season. And for a team that's got great location, they've obviously got the willingness to spend because we've seen what they're willing to do to get into the ACC, and they've already made the conference championship game and the playoffs. So they lose a lot, but I think long-term, I think you have to be pretty optimistic about their ability, especially if they can continue to get like classes number 30 to be a factor in the ACC. So I think SMU definitely a program on the rise here.
Honestly, the ACC was where I kind of found myself focusing on this because I've got Georgia Tech, Duke, and Syracuse all written down as well. The question about Georgia Tech, 21st rated class this year, 33rd last year after multiple classes outside of the top 50. So clearly making a major step forward. Are we just ready to officially buy into Brent Key permanently? Because, like, remember, interim clearly made an impact right away. Interims generally don't turn into long-term successful coaching tenures, but are we ready to? I mean, I spent all of last episode being like, I really like Georgia Tech. So
I'm buying it. I wasn't a couple years ago, but I'm buying Georgia Tech now. I think number one, Brent Key's done a good job at hiring coordinators. Yeah, Buster Faulkner is OC. He had Tyler Santucci last season. He's gone to the NFL, so they replaced him with Blake Gideon. I think he's done a good job of being the CEO of the program, but also like building the culture, building the team. He's been great at that. And also, you look at their recruiting class this year. You mentioned it; it's a top 25 haul. They have brought in one of the 5-stars, like Josh Petty, one of their tackles, may play right away. And so not only is it translating in what we're seeing, like the results, but you're also seeing it now start to pay off in recruiting, which will pay off in 26 and 27. So I'm buying Brent Key at Georgia Tech. I think I am fully bought into the tenure after being skeptical at the start.
Syracuse last three classes prior to Fran Brown's 2 classes, I should say. So Dino Baber's class is 88th, 68th, and 60th. They finished 41st this year, 37th last year. That is a direct correlation and tie back to Fran Brown's ability to recruit, of course. Duke with the 31st rated class this year, and that's with an average of 51, so 20 spots higher in their recruiting this year. Excellent job by Manny Diaz. I think the ACC, kind of a hat tip for me from a overachievement standpoint. Are they top 4? Are they top 5? Are they competing with Texas and Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and now Oregon, who is consistently a top 5 recruiter now? The 5th best roster in America, the Oregon Ducks, 3 straight top 8 classes. No, they're not on that level. But I think to see SMU, Georgia Tech, Duke, and Syracuse, 3 teams, maybe not Georgia Tech, but all 4 of those teams traditionally not recruiting at this level now up in that range, I think is a really, really big deal for the ACC. They need a good, healthy middle class.
Yeah, they do. I think full credit to Fran Brown at Syracuse. I think much like Brent Key, it was fair to be skeptical early on about the coaching hire. And so far, back-to-back top 45 classes. That's a step forward. Like what Manny Diaz did last year at Duke, also what he did in the portal. Great class this year. I think if you wanted to look at the opposite side of this, we did not see the Bill Belichick bump at North Carolina. And maybe we won't, but they were 43rd. And that's a drop off.
Didn't he save the class though late by adding a bunch of pieces? Like it had a chance to be one of the worst Power 4 classes of all time, right? Am I wrong on that?
I guess to some extent that's fair. I wasn't overwhelmed either by his transfer class so far. So I know they keep hyping up they're going to be the 33rd NFL team. I mean, we've seen that. How many times have you seen that?
That's a media company.
Right.
Wait. Sorry. That is a general manager front office placement company and a media company.
Yes. That is a very good description of it. So
I've ever told you the story about when Mike Tannenbaum interviewed me to be my agent. Have I ever told you that story? Anyway.
Oh no, this is better than talking about recruiting rankings.
No, it's not.
Okay.
No, it's not.
Okay. Anyways, back to North Carolina. I wasn't overwhelmed so far by the recruiting Belichick. Now maybe that's just first year, give him a full season, but Mac Brown was pretty good at recruiting. Wasn't great at getting the most out of the roster. Also, if you want to kind of continue the disappointment, Florida State, their highest.
We're not to the disappointment yet, Steven.
Oh, okay. I will step back.
Do you have any more positives? We're giving flowers here, Steven. We're not bringing people down to earth here. What other good team? What other teams stood out to you? I've got more. I can keep going.
I was just going to give a hat tip to Stanford. They are 5th in the ACC in roster talent over the last 5 years. 49th class. Need to see it translate, but they are squarely in the top half of the conference by recruiting rankings and talent.
I'm going to go both USCs. USC, here's what's interesting to me. They had that 70th rated class in 2022. That was the transition year, right? To Lincoln Riley, I believe.
Yes.
So they finished 70th because they didn't sign a bunch of guys in that class. If you take that class out, their last 4 classes are 7th, 8th, 17th, and 14th. They finished 14th this year. That is an average recruiting ranking of 11th. That's a really good roster if you just take out that one transitionary class. So good job by Lincoln Riley there. South Carolina also feels like it's taken a small step forward. I'm going to package this with Nebraska, actually. It's the Marcus Satterfield conversation. What South Carolina has done under Shane Beamer is what I think Nebraska needs to do. And Nebraska's had 3 straight top 25 classes. Solid recruiting by Nebraska. They need to go one notch higher. South Carolina has gone, they've been kind of consistently around top 25 status most of the time that the recruiting rankings have been around. But South Carolina has gone from sort of like 32nd, I think is their average recruiting ranking. They're now, their last 3 classes are 16th, 22nd, and 18th. Nebraska needs to be like 17th every year, not 22nd. And I know that seems like a small difference, but I do think that puts them closer to Penn State territory and further away from Iowa, Wisconsin territory and Maryland territory and Michigan State territory. I think they need to take, so credit to Shane Beamer for sort of taking South Carolina like up a notch since he got there in recruiting. And I think that's where what I need to see from Matt Rule is that one, like, good job so far, one little notch up. Well, I think is what Nebraska needs to sort of kind of complete the program build. If that does that make sense?
It does. So one thing to keep in mind on South Carolina, the 2021 class ranked 80th. And so that's sort of skewing their average. So to your point, if you plug in like 25 or something, they are much closer to middle of the pack in the SEC. I will pose this on South Carolina and Nebraska. I think you're spot on. If you can raise your talent level just by a little bit, you're talking about 2 teams that can be playoff contenders. The other side of that is they can probably keep recruiting at this level. And if Raiola and Sellers continue to hit like we think, then they're probably in pretty good shape. And so I think these 2 teams will be an interesting test of a pretty solid baseline of talent, but also potentially 2 big-time difference makers at quarterback, and how does that close the gap in talent? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. I think, and a lot of times, and it's not necessarily true for Nebraska, but it's true for South Carolina level programs like Virginia Tech, Wisconsin. Like, they need to have that 2 or 3 year recruiting run to build the roster that then becomes the team that is memorable and historic. And that's just sort of not where the game is anymore, right? Like, this progression of like year 1 to year 2 to year 3, it's not like kind of where we are. You just have to kind of keep coming at it from every angle. And so for Nebraska, I think they have enough resources to just be better in recruiting.
Yes.
Does that, and again, that's not meant to be disparaging because they've been a solid recruiting team. I mean, if you look at they were 22 this year, 18 last year. That's 2 really good classes back to back for Nebraska. But they're sort of like 25th before that, 41st before that. I want to see them like 16, 18, 15, 13, 18, like kind of get into that Penn State area. And if you get into that Penn State area in the Big Ten, I think you could compete at a higher level. I think that's sort of the last remaining step, I feel like, for Nebraska. That's all. Colorado also pretty good. Got to give credit to Colorado, of course, doing good job the last 2 years, or 3 years, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, not only Deion's work in the portal, it feels like this class was 37th nationally. That's been their best class by far. Sorry, but they had a 30th ranked class in 2023. But it does feel like they've kind of stabilized a little bit on the baseline talent, and they were still pretty heavy in the portal. But I like to see Colorado, if I'm talking about roster building, I like to see teams that are built a little bit more in terms of high school talent than you supplement through the portal. So maybe we're seeing Colorado sort of flip their strategy a little bit. But this also, like, the Big 12 is just a cluster in recruiting rankings.
A couple other teams here, 6 through 9 in the 2025 rankings, which is Michigan 6, Auburn 7, Florida 8, Texas A&M 9. 3 first-year coaches with their first-year classes there. I guess Hugh Freeze is in his second year, I should say. But Sharon Moore and Mike Elko in their first seasons, 2 top 10 classes. And Auburn, Michigan, and Florida all setting 5-year highs, 5-year high watermarks inside the top 10. Those are the best classes that those 3 programs have had over the last 5 years. So that's sort of, again, Florida, that's a testament to the job of patience around Billy Napier. With Michigan, it's a testament to the job that Sharon Moore has done sort of in the second half of the season and recruiting-wise. And then I think Hugh Freeze, he hit the trail. That was his plan. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if they're going to win anything. But that was his plan, was to hit it hard and do better in actual recruiting. And they did. Top 7 class for Auburn. So
I think Michigan's been one of the biggest winners of the offseason, or basically since the end of November. You get Bryce Underwood to commit, then you beat Ohio State, then you beat Alabama in the bowl game. You close with a top 10 class. I mean, I know it's sort of cliche to say they won the offseason, but from the midpoint of November to now, the outlook of this team has changed so much. I think on Auburn, I think you're spot on. I mean, it's been pretty bumpy the first couple of years for Hugh Freeze. They've had 2 losing seasons, missed a bowl game last year. I think this year's pretty much got to be make or break, considering some of the potential coaching changes you could see out there. Like if there is a John Summerall you want to go and get if you're Auburn, I think you got to deliver. So I think Hugh Freeze at this point is kind of out of reasons to not deliver a winning season there.
All right. Here's the 4 teams I want to talk about from a concern standpoint or have questions, because some of this is the size of the classes and the availability, and some of these teams do a lot more work in the portal. So it's not the end all be all. But I do think, and I guess maybe this is where I should start. Don't you still believe that recruiting is the most important roster metric? It's less important than it was, but it's still the number one metric, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to put like a percentage on it, if you will.
Yeah.
Like if we were creating a formula, is it like 95 or 90%? Like it's hard to put that into words, but I still think, and I mentioned this, I would want to build my team high school supplement through portal.
I feel, like it would have been like 98% like 15 years ago. It's probably like 85%, or that's maybe fair. Even like 80% now. I do think you have to recruit top 15 classes consistently year over year. You need to supplement in the portal with key pieces, maybe the quarterback, and then you got to pay to retain your current players. Then you got to get a little bit lucky as well. There's the 4 I got questions for you. Clemson, Oklahoma, Florida State, and Michigan State. Clemson 26 this year. They went from, and here's the issue with this. To me, they had the 5th rated class. They've gone down every year, 5 to 10 to 11 to 11 to 26. 5 straight years of going down. Now, they are finally evolving in the portal part of this conversation. So what's your concern level there? Oklahoma, 3 top 8 classes in a row. And while 17th isn't terrible this year, compared to Texas at number 1 and 11th in the conference, that could cause problems in theory. Florida State has just stopped being a top 10 recruiter. Like they are just not a top. They're barely top 15. Their last 5 classes, they were 19th this year, 12th, 20th, 23rd, average recruiting ranking 18.8. They're just not a top 10 recruiter anymore. And that doesn't make any sense to me. And then we can get to Michigan State. So I'll turn you loose here.
I think the one that concerns me the most would be Florida State, honestly. I trust Mike Norvell to get the most out of the roster. Now, it's hard to sit here and say that after how bad last year was. I do think there were some things behind the scenes they needed to clean up, and I think they're on the right track of doing that. They have been very transfer heavy. They have missed on some top recruits. Travis Hunter go back to that story a couple years ago. He was a Florida State commit up until the end, and they've missed on some other high profile guys. But I also think that this is part of the problem for Norvell right now, which is they have to do a better job in recruiting the high school ranks, but it's hard to sell the high school recruiting when you're sitting here coming off a 2-10 season. So you have to dip back into the portal. But Braden, you remember I know this is like 10 years ago, so it feels like ages, but when we were doing this exercise before, Florida State was the number 1 team in recruiting in the ACC, and Miami has actually passed Clemson over the last 2 seasons. So Miami and Clemson jumped Florida State, and Florida State went from being number 1 in the conference to number 3. So I have a lot of concerns about direction. They got to get back to recruiting the high school level better, and we just haven't seen that under Norvell.
I mean, they would have been top 5 every year, all throughout Bowden's tenure. Like, I mean, for decades, this is a top 5 recruiting team. So that was just weird. Like, it's not that I didn't know it, but it's just seeing all the numbers lined up next to each other. You're like, oh, you're just not top 10 anymore, and barely top 15. Michigan State with the 56 rated class. I've always thought Michigan State, kind of going back to the South Carolina and Nebraska conversation, I always thought Michigan State had a really intriguing opportunity. And I guess Mel Tucker probably helped with this because that's what he did well, but didn't do anything else good. They should be like their 2 classes. They were 23rd and 24th a few years ago. That's about where they should be. And to me, that's like Mark D'Antonio's sweet spot when they were good and competitive every year. Yes, they're a little bit more of a developmental program, and you're going to recruit a bunch of 2 and 3 stars that then eventually need to become Thorpe Award winners. but you should be in that 20 to 30 range in recruiting. 56th is not where they need to be. They were 42nd last year, so that's a little bit concerning. I do believe in Jonathan Smith, so I'm not like super worried about it. I don't know. Where are you at on Michigan State, Oklahoma, and Clemson?
I'm not too worried about Michigan State, honestly. I think some of this is trust in Jonathan Smith, that he will continue to get the most out of the roster. Now, it would be, I think, probably they should at least be able to recruit top 30, top 35 classes. And I think, 2 years in, 42 and 56 national finish, not ideal. I think it'll be interesting to see. Ask me after 2025 if they're still recruiting in the 56 range. I will be very, very worried. But for now,
that's true.
I'm going to sort of just hold on being concerned about their recruiting. I'm not that worried either about Clemson. Their individual player average is a little bit higher. I think they had like 15 commits this year, so it's a little bit of a smaller class.
Right.
Oklahoma, I will say one of the things that surprised me when I was putting this together, Oklahoma being fifth in the SEC kind of surprised me. I actually thought they would be a little bit lower, and this is after the.
You're talking about the aggregate, not this year's class, because
right.
this year's class they were 11th in the SEC.
Yes,
those other classes were Big 12 classes.
Yes, that surprised me though, to see them in the 5-year average be fifth in the SEC. I know they recruit great talent, but I just kind of anticipated that A&M in Florida would be ahead of them. Instead, they're fifth in the conference over the last 5 years. So I think it's just not only that, if you just look at like roster talent, like Oklahoma sets up to me as one of the most interesting teams in the country this year, because they've got talent. They've got a coach who we think's pretty good on defense. I trust Brent Venables there, but the Mateer Arbuckle combo is going to be so fascinating from how does it work, but also the pressure on both of them.
I love a good 2003 throwback, Oklahoma throwback. That's what it's going to feel like. It's going to feel like 03 Oklahoma. So anyway, keep an eye on those four for sure. That brings us right to the quarterbacks. Here's my first question. We have I counted 26 top 300 quarterbacks according to ESPN. Just again, I'm going to bounce around using the different rankings here because they're all kind of about the same. Some are better than others, but that's a really high number. And certainly quarterbacks get clicks, but quarterbacks touch the football on every play. So 26 out of 300, that seems like a very high number. That's a bunch of teams signing a high 4-star quarterback. There cannot be that many good quarterbacks, can there?
That's a good question. Are they overvalued a little bit because of how much we value quarterbacks, you think?
They shouldn't be, though, because it's the quarterback. But I guess that ultimately what happens is they get outsized influence on our conversation.
Yes.
Because like Curtis Rourke is so much more important, but like that's a MAC player at Indiana. Really important player, very good college quarterback. But is he better than like the top 10 defensive linemen at football? Probably not. So you see, that's always been the age-old debate within recruiting circles is how do you evaluate a guy who has outsized influence on the game because they touch the football all the time? And so I think this is some of that reflection. Like we're seeing some of that reflected in these rankings, but there's just no chance that there are 26 or 30 guys that are worthy of 4-star status. Like when I was at Rivals, this is back 20 years ago. Oh my God, that's a long time. There would be 4 top 100 quarterbacks. Maybe you get to 5, maybe a 6th one is in there, but like right around 100, you'd be at like quarterback 5, 6, or 7, and now you've got, you got all kinds of guys that they move up rankings for obvious reasons. You know what I mean?
If Braden Gall was in charge of a personnel department, would you go very heavy in defensive linemen and then sort of find like a Curtis Rourke at quarterback? If I'm telling you that your budget does not allow you to, like, you have to pick.
Yes. I think, and especially if I was coaching in like the Big 12 or the ACC, where I think that if I want to, especially if I'm at a smaller program like a Wake Forest or like a Kansas State or something, maybe that's the wrong example because Avery Johnson is 5-star, but like if you told me I've got $100 to spend and I could buy like 6 elite defensive linemen and 1 like 3-star quarterback, that's what I would do. I would do that. Now I realize that we're 2 days after the Eagles winning the Super Bowl, but I think you give yourself a higher floor and a chance to win more games if you are elite along the line of scrimmage and you give a mediocre quarterback a better surrounding cast than if you have, 5-star quarterback that has no time to throw. I don't know.
I think I would build my team the same way. I would probably build it like defensive line, offensive line, find a cheap running back, find like a Curtis Rourke type of quarterback that's just solid.
Yeah. Mid-major guy.
Yeah. And we dominate the line of scrimmage. Maybe we're not flashy.
How many games did Drake May win in North Carolina?
I had some good seasons, yeah. I mean,
but were they winning championships?
No, they were not winning championships. No.
Okay. Well, how many wins does Jacob Coker have?
Oh, he's got a championship ring
at Alabama.
Yeah, right.
That's what I'm saying. Like Stetson Bennett can win you a championship if you've got an elite team around him. I think that's the point.
Yeah, I would take that.
Walk on JUCO. As long as you got Jalen Carter, you're fine. All right. Bryce Underwood, obviously, I'm looking at the Athlon Sports, athlonsports.com. Make sure you check that out. Bryce Underwood, of course, number one, as bought and paid for by, what is it, Larry Ellison, who bought and paid for Bryce Underwood. Nope. And that's not, I don't say that as a slight. I say that as go get your money and good job, Michigan. That's a compliment. So Bryce Underwood has a chance to start for Michigan. That's number one on the list. Is there anybody else that you would consider? That means the number one player in the class. Like, is there anybody else that you'd even consider in competition with Underwood as the most high profile, most successful, most interesting potential true freshman quarterback in 2025?
I don't. I think Underwood is by far the most likely to start at quarterback. There are some others that are kind of in that second tier, but as far as top tier talent, interest level, potential, what he means to Michigan, I think he's by far the number one impact transfer freshman quarterback for the season.
Who else is on that? Who else is in the conversation in your mind?
I think Keelan Russell at Alabama is also interesting. The quarterback situation at Alabama is fascinating to begin with. I have wondered, and I would love to hear your opinion on this one. Jalen Milroe, I am just fascinated to see what the NFL thinks of him because I know it's only going to take one. Somebody's going to get really enamored with all the physical talent and tools. But I also wondered at times last year, did he fit the offense and what DeBoer wanted to do? And now you have Russell, you've got Ty Simpson, you've got Austin Mack. Like, you have a lot of good quarterbacks there. And, if you're Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb, a good way to forget last year is to start the freshman. He plays really well, gives you someone to build around. So
gives you an excuse. It gives you an excuse if you don't win games.
Yeah, could change the narrative real quick. So I think Russell's pretty interesting. What do you think about Milroe in the draft? I know you were down at the Senior Bowl.
Not a lot of big reviews from NFL people. He lost ground, I thought, based on conversations around with scouts and media and NFL folks. I think in that draft, I would have had him sort of early second, kind of a Jalen Hurts type of player, where if you build your offense around him, Jalen Hurts, I think, is a far better thrower of the football. I also think he's a far more, like, Jalen Hurts was mature as like a freshman at Alabama. Like, he's always been a mature, hardworking sort of professional adult, even when he was young. And I'm not sure. I think Milroe needs to sort of grow into that a little bit. I mean, I think he's got a very Michael Vick-like skill set, a little undersized, lightning quick, huge arm. I don't think he's got the accuracy that Vick had, especially in the intermediate game. I could see him slipping into like the third round. The guy I love is Kyle McCord. Kyle McCord is the guy that if I'm quarterback desperate, because I would not take Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders with the top pick. I just wouldn't. But I wouldn't take Jackson Dart either. But the guy I like in like the fourth round, if you can get him, Kyle McCord. I would give him a shot to go full like Kirk Cousins on somebody, Dak Prescott, whatever.
I was going to go with Tyler Shuck.
I think okay. Here's my all right. Here's some.
If he can stay healthy, though, that's the question.
The injuries are a major problem. I also heard some stuff about his general demeanor towards others.
Okay,
just gonna drop that nugget in there.
Okay, well,
all right. You haven't earned. How about that? You haven't earned anything yet, big guy. Like, let's. I don't know. This is what I heard. This is just me recounting some stories.
All right, what about while I'm asking you about Senior Bowl intel? This is really about shaping Steven's Steeler mock draft here. What about Jackson Dart?
Jackson Dart is very similar to Will Levis in this one way, which is his very emotional and passionate about the game, which is good. but that can sometimes be a double-edged sword and can hurt you if you get too caught up in the emotion of it. I think that's a problem for Will Levis. He gets too committed to the thing that he's passionate about. And so the question is, do you let the emotion fuel you and drive you, or is it different? I also think he fumbled like 4 times under center. He's going to have to learn to play under center. That's a big thing for him. But I think he was much bigger than people expect. Like, he was thicker and bigger than people expected, almost full 6'2", 225, 226, like, quick processor. I think he probably moves up boards and is like a early 3rd, late 2nd rounder. I thought Milroe went down, Dart went up. I thought Shuck did go up, but I think there's questions about sort of like, he gets along with his team really well, but there's questions about sort of like personality and leadership, I think, there for him. And I think the injury is the number one issue. The guy who throws the prettiest ball down the field accurately is Kyle McCord. Like, that's the guy who I think throws the best football down the field. And honestly, Will Howard might be number 2 on that list. I think those guys are like 3rd-round picks, and they have a chance to like get some snaps in the NFL. So,
totally.
There may also be 0 starting NFL quarterbacks in this draft class. So,
I was going to say, I think the desperation of quarterbacks, McCord, Dart, Shuck, whoever you are, they're probably going to get overdrafted.
Yeah. I've come around on Cam being number 1, though, in the class. Not number 1 overall, but number 1 quarterback in the class. Cam Ward, number 1 over Shedeur Sanders. But I would have him like 21st or something like that, and I'd have Shedeur like 35th. Like, I just don't think they're number 1 and 2 at that position, but I just don't think they're top 5, top 10 picks. Quarterback tax drives those guys up boards, obviously. But all right, anyway, back to freshmen. You have number 2, you got Keelan Russell, which of course is interesting. You mentioned Malik Washington, number 3 at Maryland. He is not the number 3 rated quarterback recruit, but he's got a path to play. Of course, UCLA transfer. We'll get to this. Justin Martin is going to be in the mix. There's a pretty clear path for him to take over at Maryland, right?
Yes, there is. And he is also a Maryland native. So it is like a bit of a homecoming also for a Maryland team that needs some positive things on offense. Also, I think Mike Locksley could probably use a good season this year. So kind of put your eggs in building the freshman up for the next couple of years could really pay off for Maryland. But Washington was one of the top, I think it was like top 5, depending on where you look in the quarterback hall. But when they lost Billy Edwards, you bring in Malik Washington. He's got this high pedigree coming in. I think it's pretty obvious that he's got a chance to start from day 1.
I think he was the 3rd rated dual threat quarterback, but I think he's like the 6th or 7th quarterback overall, roughly speaking. So definitely not definitely a big time recruit for Maryland for sure. So we'll see what happens with him. Who's number 4 on your list? I'm going to make you say his name.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm terrible with names, so I'll just like it's Jaron. Yeah, Sagapolete, however you say his name, from California. But that's not the most interesting thing about his
Sagapolete.
There you go. That's better.
No, the interesting thing is signing with Oregon in the early transfer period,
Yes.
or the early signing period, going to practice for the team, and then still deciding to go back to your first commitment, Cal Golden Bears. Fascinating to me.
I think the reasoning for that is that if you read between the lines when he practiced at Oregon, the quarterbacks there were pretty good. I think that's the vibe that I picked up from some of the quotes. So yes, California's offense, just goes back like to something else interesting. They now have Brian Harsin and Nick Rolovich on the same staff. They brought in Devin Brown as a transfer from Ohio State. And then, of course, now they have this highly touted freshman quarterback. So California's offense is going to be very, very interesting this year.
No, I totally agree. Who would have thunk that Cal, because they also sent Mendoza to Indiana. Like, who would have thunk that Cal could have been the epicenter of quarterback storylines in the offseason? It's fantastic. Look, we'll see. I think Devin Brown is one of the more intriguing transfer quarterbacks, and that doesn't get a lot of coverage in all of this. Let's see. You've got Antoine Hill at Memphis. Of course, Ryan Silverfield started. Seth Hennigan, just saw him down there at the Senior Bowl. He won a lot of people over, by the way, in his performance, but he's number 5. So they've done that in the past. Julian Lewis, of course, big time recruit going to Colorado. Expect to see him early on. Bryce Baker at North Carolina, and then a whole lot of other players. So any other names you want folks to keep an eye on in the freshman class? We got to get to the portal here.
I think the other name to watch would be Deuce Knight at Auburn. I think it is more likely that Jackson Arnold starts, considering how interested Hugh Freeze in Auburn was in to bring in Jackson Arnold. But if he struggles, maybe Deuce Knight gets in there. But I think Antoine Hill, you mentioned him at Memphis, is probably I I think got one of the cleaner paths to start. Like they brought in Brendan Lewis as a transfer from Nevada, but they've already started. You know, you mentioned it. Seth Hennigan as a true freshman was as awesome, and he had a great career. Wouldn't surprise me if they do this again with him.
Yep. All right, you want to get into some of the veterans that are transferring here? Look at some of these names because Carson Beck is number one on every list, ranking these guys. Whether you go to the Athletic or on 3 or 24/7, he's number one on this list. I think he's number one in my book because of the offense surrounding him. With everything they're bringing back at Miami, I think it's a really, really good offense. Is he worth $4.3 million? I don't think so. He's not the most interesting to me, though. I do think he's a really good player. But honestly, Steven, I think one of the things I noticed about this class is the guys that I find most interesting are the less proven ones that could eventually be great down the road, but aren't necessarily like Connor Wigman, Jackson Arnold. Those are the kind of guys that I find Mensa going to Duke. Like I find all those guys to be more interesting. Carson Beck, there's not a lot of established guys transferring schools this year, other than Beck at the top.
Yeah, I think Carson Beck would be number one on my board. Also, with the full caveat that there is a major question with him, his elbow injury. Now, we did see, other quarterbacks have come back. Brock Purdy had surgery on his elbow and ended up playing well this year for the 49ers. So there's the injury question. I think from an offensive standpoint, from a firepower standpoint, I think he's a pretty seamless, not necessarily the same player, but as far as high caliber quarterback, he definitely fits. But I think the story of this transfer class is the sort of the second tier, like you mentioned. And there's a bunch of guys in here that I like. There's also some guys that, I think second chance bounce backs like Miller Moss at Louisville, great fit. How does it work out? So, Beck would be my number one. And I think probably I'd throw John Mateer in there as well.
I think John Mateer packaged with Ben Arbuckle at Oklahoma is the most interesting combination of movement we saw in college football this year. Because of he is such a fun player to watch. I'm fascinated with that system, which is while it is more of a old school kind of physical, I don't want to say Urban Meyer kind of Tim Tebow type offense. It does have more they're going to push the ball down the field, but he's so young, and it's such an interesting combination. Mateer is such a fun and interesting player to watch, and Oklahoma on top of that is in such a very strange and interesting season with Brent Venables. It combines into this cocktail of intrigue that exists in Norman, Oklahoma. It's by far the most interesting one there. I don't think it's necessarily the best, but it could be the best, and that's what's interesting to me.
I think this is the hardest thing that I have in trying to guess the impact of Mateer. And if you were asking me to rank where he was in the SEC among quarterbacks, he's probably in the middle somewhere right now. But that also is the challenge, is that he's played Mountain West and Pac-12, Oregon State, Pac-12 defenses, and now he's going to the toughest conference in college football. So how does that jump work out? I mean, on paper, you're just basically taking the same offense, OC, and quarterback and shoving them into the oven and asking them to be good right away, which could totally happen. And we've seen that at other teams. But also the jump from that level of play to the SEC is pretty steep too.
Yeah, he's again, it's a major program with a coach who's got something to prove while bringing his youngest coordinator in the game with him. That's just a fascinating cocktail. So number 3 on most lists, he's the top again, there's only 2 players by all these lists of any position that are among the top 20 transfer players regardless of position. But the number 3 quarterback, who I think is number 20 on the on 3 list, is Fernando Mendoza. Over 3,000 yards, did not play in the last 2 games that Cal lost. I think, you look at some of the performances, played very, very well against Stanford, had a big-time game, over 10 yards per attempt, 75% completion percentage, over almost 400 yards against Oregon State. Was very good in the Miami game, and they got hosed by the officials in that game, if you'll recall. Should have won that one. Is he better than Curtis Rourke?
I don't think so.
I don't either.
I don't think that far off, though. I think I actually really like this pickup for Indiana. He completed almost 70% of his passes at Cal last year, only 6 picks, pretty efficient. I just like his style of play, fitting well with Kirk Cignetti in Indiana's offense. Indiana's got good receivers coming back too. So I don't necessarily think that they'll be as successful in 2025, but I think with Mendoza stepping in, I don't think their offense will miss too much of a beat next year.
Yeah, I like the move. I know Indiana fans are fired up about it. That's for sure. The Nashville Indiana folk that I always talk about, they're very fired up about it. Next on the list is the young man Sagapule Telele for Cal. He's number 26. Transfer number 37 is your boy from Florida State. You want to say his last name? Luke Cromenhawk. He's going to go to Mississippi State. This is a 4-star recruit, big time 4-star recruit, top 50 player. He was the number 4 rated quarterback in his class. What do we make of him going to Mississippi State?
Check back in 2026 because I think Blake Shapen's going to start for Mississippi State this year, but very talented. I do not think Florida State should have let him get away.
Next on the list is Malik Murphy. I think you've had enough chances. I feel like sure, Oregon State's going to let him play, but I don't know. It's not that interesting to me.
Isn't the more interesting thing Duke basically ran him off to get Darian Mensah, and then
who's next on the list?
Right. That's I kind of
paid almost $3 million to get Mensah to come to Duke, which that's the most Manny Diaz thing I think I've heard. But I say that as a compliment, like Michigan with Underwood.
But don't you like that though? If you're Jim Phillips and you're sitting in your office, wishing that these teams would be good, Duke spent this X amount of money on a transfer quarterback. That's great for the conference.
I'm pissed for John Sumrall and Tulane to lose a very young, talented quarterback. But yes, I think it is a good sign for Duke and for the ACC that they made a move like this. I totally agree. He's a really good player, and only scratching the surface of the talent that he's got potentially for Tulane last year. So I think if you're looking at this list of the top 15 or 20 transfer quarterbacks, he's among the most interesting and maybe the most talented, and will guaranteed to start right away.
Yes, I agree. I also think he's probably a little underrated in On3's
I agree
rankings there. By the way, speaking of well-traveled quarterbacks, we should mention that John Sumrall landed TJ Finley at Tulane. So he's been at Auburn, LSU, Western Kentucky, and Tulane.
I should have used TJ Finley playing in the Super Bowl instead of Jaden Rashada. So Finley actually has played. He's going to play in all those places. Mensah last year, 66% completion percentage, 2,700 yards, 22 touchdowns, 9.5 yards per attempt, only 6 interceptions on as a freshman last year for Tulane. So really good time, really big time pickup for Duke. This is the area that I'm interested in. Is Mensah. Jackson Arnold's number is next on the list. I could put him way up on this list. I think he got not unfairly benched for Hawkins in the middle of the season. I thought they could have been more patient with him and allowed him to sort of work through some of his issues. I actually think this is a huge pickup for Auburn. He is scheduled to sort of start right away. I know they landed some, Deuce Knight, right, as the freshman that they brought in, but I think it's Arnold's job all the way. They got really good receivers, young ones from last year and some in the portal. It's Hugh Freeze's offense. I would expect Jackson Arnold to add more balance to his game. And I think Arnold's going to have a really good year. So I don't know how good Auburn's going to be. Again, I don't know how good they're going to be, but I think Arnold's a huge pickup. I think it's a major loss for Oklahoma. But we already talked about how much we love Mateer, so whatever.
The hard part, I think, with Jackson Arnold is so much was going wrong around him at Oklahoma last year. The offensive line was bad. Receivers were hurt. They were asking walk-ons to play major snaps. Deion Burks was one of their top pickups to transfer. He got hurt. So, a lot of last year was things that were out of his control. Could he have played better? Yes. I think if you go back to that Alamo Bowl, and we're digging kind of into the archives here, in the 2023 season, when he started against Arizona, and we should mention too, at Oklahoma, they had the coordinator change in the middle of the season, and Seth Latrona's first year got fired. But if you watch that Alamo Bowl, you see the talent. You're like, okay, I can see the arm strength. I can see everything he can do. So I think the question is, can he put it all together? And the supporting cast at Auburn's pretty solid. I mean, I trust they'll figure out their ground game. Offensive line should be solid. I think they might have the best receiving core in the SEC. We'll check back after spring practice on that one. But, I mean, it's all there. And his rushing arm could be a really potent combination in that offense.
No, I like this Arnold pickup big time. Air Noland is next on the list from Ohio State to South Carolina, almost a top 50 quarterback, 4-star, the number 5 quarterback in his class. He's not going to be starting behind Lenore Sellers. Then you've got Miller Moss, and this is, again, the intriguing area here. Miller Moss going from USC to Louisville, 4-star player. That just strikes me as a guy that's going to have really good numbers in Jeff Brom's system by the end of the season. Is he an elite player that we maybe thought going into the USC season last year? Maybe not. Is he an NFL player? No. But is he going to have like really productive college stats in a Jeff Brom offense? Probably.
Yeah, I sort of think there were things that Miller Moss could have worked on and certainly played better at USC. Maybe unfairly the scapegoat for some of the problems. But also, I just trust Jeff Brom. Like, just whatever quarterback is in that offense is going to put up yards and they're going to score points. So I like the idea of Jeff Brom not necessarily taking over a reclamation project, but taking on a quarterback who's got some talent, some things to work with, and they'll figure it out, much like they did with Tyler Shuck this year.
I know that USC's got is it Longstreet? Who's the freshman coming in? The 5-star Hassan.
Yeah, Longstreet.
What's the quarterback battle look like at USC? How do you handicap that?
I would put Jaden Maivia in the pole position. I think he's probably the starter in 2025.
Connor Wigman next on the list. I love this for Houston. I think this is Willie Fritz is going to turn Connor Wigman into a star. Full stop. That's it. 5-star kid, lost his job at A&M, goes across town, basically, or a couple miles down the street, and goes to Houston. I think he's going to be a really good player in the Big 12.
So, fun fact. Willie Fritz coached Connor Wigman's dad at Sam Houston, like back in the 1990s. So
that's good stuff by you, my guy.
Yeah, Willie's been around a while, but I'm going to go ahead and put down the marker here. I think Houston's going to be one of the most improved teams in the Big 12 next year.
No surprise there.
Yeah, Willie Fritz year 2. Also, Connor Wigman, really ultra talented quarterback, and I think they've done a good job of revamping their staff too at Houston. So count me in on a believer in Connor Wigman in 2025.
So next on the list, Caden Salter. He's obviously going to be in a competition to start with the freshman, but you got to think he's going to be the starting quarterback, right?
I think so. The other thing I like about Salter is Colorado's had so many offensive line issues the last couple of years. His mobility could be a really big asset for them early on.
Liberty very disappointing this year.
Yeah.
In general, and he did not. 15 touchdowns, 1,800 yards. Didn't exactly take off. Obviously, almost 600 yards rushing. So that's what he brings to the table, to your point. Michael Van Buren goes from Mississippi State to LSU. That's a backup there. Not going to start over Garrett Nussmeier. How about Mark Gronowski from South Dakota State to Iowa? Is this Iowa finding a guy finally?
Yes.
They've tried every transfer from everywhere in the world.
Yeah, they also bringing in Hank Brown, the former Auburn quarterback this offseason too. So
Hank Brown is the most Iowa football name for a quarterback ever.
Well,
Hank Brown.
I
take it back. Hank White would have been better.
Mark Gronowski, love this pickup for Iowa. They have a
totally
dude at quarterback. He was a star at South Dakota State. I was just looking at On3's rankings while we're talking. I think he's too low. I think I'd put him up a little bit higher. One concern, he did have offseason, I think, shoulder surgery. I think that they expect him back by the summer. But in terms of like pickup for Iowa, I know they invested heavily in NIL. This is a good investment for him.
And this is one of the only like true kind of traditional quarterback transfers, right? Like if you look at this list, Carson Beck is a senior who played his entire career at Georgia. He's the only other guy in the top 20 that was like a senior making this move. This is a guy who's making his move late in his career as a veteran to go play up at a better program. This is kind of a more traditional kind of transfer, right? Like this is a little bit more of like what we expected in college football the last 20 years.
Yeah, and I think he could have went to obviously he could have went to the NFL, but I think there was NFL interest in Gronowski. And so South Dakota State had the coaching change. He decides to go to the power level and try at Iowa. So I think this is a great pickup for Iowa. I love it.
Bo Prabula is going to compete to win for Missouri. Very highly publicized transfer from Penn State during the playoff there. No guarantee that he's the starting quarterback. I think he probably has the edge, though. They've got a young freshman coming in. Walker White is really interesting to me, talent-wise. From Auburn to Baylor, he was a top 100 player, high 4-star, number 7 quarterback in the nation when he came out of high school. He doesn't have a path to start with Baylor returning their guy, but I think that's one I'm going to keep an eye on and kind of circle for like down the road.
Yeah, much like Michael Van Buren, I think I would file away Walker White for 2026. I think there's a chance that Sawyer Robertson had a nice season for Baylor this year. If nothing else, stockpiling quarterbacks is hard. So if you have a chance to do it for like if you're Dave Aranda, that's a pretty good idea to do so. Walker White was really talented coming out of high school, didn't quite meet expectations at Auburn. So I like the pickup for Baylor. You mentioned Prabula. I think he's probably the starter. The question with him is going to be the sample size is so small. He's been a kind of a change of pace quarterback. I kind of trust Kirby Moore and Drinkowitz, but there's a lot of unknown here too.
Yeah, I mean, good athlete. They can run him if they
Yeah.
need to start, get him kind of loosened up. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these guys are unknown when they move to the next, other than like Carson Beck, like a guy that's kind of totally proven. Jaden Rashad is next on this list. By the way, Sawyer Robinson, 32 total touchdowns last year for Baylor, so he's not going anywhere. The next two are also very interesting. Thomas Castellanos going from Boston College to Florida State, and then Devin Dampier going from New Mexico to Utah. That is two teams that are used to being top 10, 15, that were preseason top 15, that are now having to reclaim themselves in the offseason. And they go out and get two guys, two former 3-star kids, but kind of proven commodities at their previous stops and probably going to be the starters at both of those jobs.
Yes, I think both will start. And there is a ton of pressure on both, especially Castellanos at Florida State.
Fun player to watch.
Very, very interesting and fun, dynamic quarterback. The question for both of them, and I think that's oddly enough, is like we're grouping these two together. They actually kind of are the same player to some extent. They can run around a lot. I think there's some questions about what do you get consistently out of them in the passing game. Dampier had like 12 interceptions, I think, at New Mexico last season, like under 60% completion rate.
The 1-to-1 touchdown interception ratio, never good. 12 touchdowns, 12 interceptions.
Yeah.
But he did have 1,200 yards rushing and I think he had 19 touchdowns on the ground. So
yes, I think to go back to Castellanos for a second, Florida State is putting pretty much everything into him. I mean, they're going to build the offense around Malzahn and Castellanos. And Castellanos, of course, was at UCF some time ago. He went to BC. He got benched last year, and he finds his way to Florida State. I think the rushing ability is going to work out. We'll see about the rest of it. And for Dampier, I think the thing that interests me the most is Jason Beck, his offensive coordinator at New Mexico, now at Utah. Also, Utah's bringing back all five of them, offensive line starters next year. I know you'd like that.
I like it. Castellanos had 1,100 yards rushing 2 years ago. To your point, got benched the last month of the season. So we'll see. They're putting a lot of pressure on a guy who got benched for Boston College last year. How about this name? Matthew Sluka. That's right. If you recognize that name, that's the UNLV kid who quit because he didn't get paid or he thought he got lied to. He's going to go to JMU. Devin Brown, we already mentioned him going to Cal. Billy Edwards from Maryland going to Wisconsin. He started last year for Maryland. Wisconsin needs an influx of talent at that position. We mentioned Justin Martin going from UCLA to Maryland. Ricky Collins going from LSU to Syracuse, probably going to be a guy who can compete for a job there. And then Lonergan from Bama to Boston College. Those are kind of your top 25. Anybody we missed that you want to mention?
Chandler Morris at Virginia is pretty interesting too. It's, of course,
Preston Stone transferring. So
yeah, Preston Stone to Northwestern. Northwestern's got a pretty good quarterback now. DeQuan Finn also rebounding back into the MAC. He was so good at Toledo a couple years ago, transferred to Baylor, didn't really work out.
Into the MAC. Okay.
Back to the MAC at Miami of Ohio, which probably makes Miami of Ohio again one of the front runners. So I did want to mention something on Sluka for a second. So there's sort of the belief that Alonzo Barnett, who was James Madison's starter last season, may not be ready to go at the start of the season. So he got hurt at the end of the regular season. I bring that up because Sluka might end up starting for James Madison. They also brought in a transfer from Richmond. So at first I was kind of like, okay, James Madison doesn't really need a starting quarterback. Then you dig into it. You're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And of course his head coach, they were Chesney, they were over at Holy Cross a few years ago too.
Well, and it's not like this guy had a roster to compete on. Like he left the team. So he's just in the portal. He's been in the portal since like August or whatever, September, I should say. So, all right, there's a lot of guys. It feels like an interesting class with a lot more potential. And maybe it's a more traditional transfer class. It doesn't feel like a lot of guys who were 2-year starters, like a Cam Ward, like a star player who's clearly elite, who'd started for multiple seasons at a Power 5 school, transferring to a totally different school. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of that in this class. It feels like a lot more guys that are moving to try to make the most of an opportunity. Maybe I'm rose-colored glasses looking at this stuff, but Mensa's one of those where you're like, oh, that's a freshman who's a starter who had a really good season, and now he's just he's moving up in competition to challenge himself and make more money, which I never begrudge a guy, but that one kind of feels a little weird. But either way, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but the Connor Wigman is the traditional story. Like you get hurt, you don't start, the other guy wins the job, you transfer down, and you go try somewhere else. Like that's pretty traditional, honestly.
Yeah, it is.
Jackson Arnold, kind of the same thing.
You asked a question last week, and I thought that it was one of those questions that kind of stuck with me throughout the week. So I was thinking about you most of over the weekend.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But you asked who are the top group of 5 quarterbacks coming back, and I was like, I started to think about this and how many transfers. You just go down the list, and you're like, that team's going to start transfer, and so the movement upward and also downward kind of works in both ways here. So there's a lot of turnover at some of these teams. One other quarterback I thought was pretty interesting was Walker Howard. You remember he was at LSU, Ole Miss, he was top 10. He's now at Louisiana.
That's right. I forgot about that.
So it sort of just illustrates this, that there's a lot of talented quarterbacks who are moving down, and some like Mensa that are moving up, and some like Beck, of course, on their last season of eligibility, looking to make an impact. So kind of a buffet, if you will, of reasons, but for the most part, there's a lot of NIL and playing time related transfers here.
I'm sorry. There's a player that stuck in my mind that I wanted to go. Ty Thompson is the name wasn't he a 5-star kid coming out of high school? Never really got. I don't think he ever had more than like 30 attempts in a season. No, he had 40 attempts last year. I think most of them came in the bowl game for Tulane behind Mensa. So,
and he's moving to tight end this year, I believe.
Yeah, just clearly never at quarterback. So. We'll see. All right. Anything else? Make sure you're checking out the YouTube page. Make sure you check out athlonsports.com. Make sure you follow Steven on all the internet sites, everywhere out there that are, stealing your attention from your family and your loved ones. Make sure you do that. Otherwise, anything else for the good folks out there?
Just wanted to mention the Athlon Sports Racing Baseball magazines should be either on newsstands or close to hitting newsstands. And also the NFL Draft magazine is coming soon as well.
What does it have? Does it have Pete Alonso on my Mets?
I have not seen the baseball covers. That is a very good question. I know
they signed him this week, or last week. So I want to make sure.
That's right. Yeah,
I want to make sure we got Pete Alonso, future home run champion of my New York Mets.
Onto
the team. He's going to protect Juan Soto in the batting order. So.
Yeah, I got Soto and Alonso confused. Must be nice to be a Mets fan this offseason instead of
ain't my money.
Being a Pirates fan and shopping at the dollar store. If you're
hey, this ain't college NIL, man. This is a billionaire hedge fund's money. It ain't my money. Spend it, man. Ain't my money. Just go maybe buy a starting pitcher though. I don't know. See if you can outbid the Dodgers for somebody. I don't know. Right. Anyway, go check out your baseball magazine where my New York Mets should win the whole thing as usual in spring before disappointing in the fall. So there you go. All right. Check out all the magazines. You can get to me on all the social media platforms as well at Braden Gall. For Steven, I'm Braden. Thanks for listening. Thanks for hanging out. Rate, review, subscribe. Give us 5 stars. Thumbs up on the notifications on the YouTube page. Make sure you check that out. And otherwise, have a great week. Congrats to the Eagles. Fly, Eagles, fly. We'll talk to you guys next time. Thanks for listening.